Right.
So we're going to get started, and I am very, very excited for this interview today. I'm going to be talking to Ebone Granger on the topic of how to raise racially conscious children. I know I get this question all the time, and I've wanted to do an interview on this topic, but really wanted to find the right person to do the interview with. And I really believe Ebone is that person. I know her personally. She is helping me raise more racially conscious children. And I'm excited for her to share tips with you all too. So welcome to everybody who's live or watching the replay. I am going to go ahead and allow Ebone to introduce herself and let us know a little bit about her, how she got interested in this topic. So Ebone, can you tell us a little bit about you and what got you here?
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for having me again. I enjoy this conversation that we have. It's an ongoing one that we will continue to have, and specifically working with the kids. And so, became interested in this probably just as a child, honestly. I don't know if it was by way of my upbringing and where my parents are from, Mississippi, but just always kind of myself was kind of conscious socially and racially, and then went on to college and majored in sociology and was like, oh my gosh, this is my world. How come no one ever told me this existed? And so, just really thrived in that space. And as a result, really decided, where could I find, a place to kind of do God's work, which was my way of doing it. And I just really wanted to work with children. Initially, I thought like women was my niche, thing. And then I ended up by way of whatever I was doing, it was like women have children. And so it was like I ended up working with children. That was just became my sweet spot. Became a school counselor, mental health therapist, but then found my way back to mothers, and eventually families. And so I just, just continue to develop and hone that skill set and the knowledge base on race, class, and gender, society in America. Did some research for a period of time with a mentor of mine. We did some publishing and just, really began to see that there are these systemic issues that are then impacting and creating and leading to mental health. And that's kind of what took me in that direction. And so that's a little bit about me.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate your time. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I do also want to just mention those of you who are here live, we definitely want to hear from you. Everyone is muted now. I'm going to continue to have you muted, but if you do have any questions throughout, definitely put them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat so Ebone can just answer the questions that we have. We will also at the end have time for you to ask questions. So definitely pose them throughout if you want to, and I will read them to Ebone, but she will be able to answer your questions at the end. So make yourself at home and feel very welcome here. And we're going to jump in. By Ebone, I would love to ask you, what does it mean to begin with to raise racially conscious children? What does that even mean?
So, again, raising racially conscious children is where you're basically making a conscious decision, a choice to decide that we are going to talk about race. We are not going to leave race as the elephant in the room or that last thing on the to do list that we really never get to. We are going to make a conscious decision that we're going to discuss race. And I think that what we see a lot of times is that minority families, this is a conversation that they have very early, with children as young as toddler age, because oftentimes their skin color comes up. And then we have begin to see as the more we diverge into this and we talk about it, that non-minority families really kind of steer away from this conversation. And sometimes have been taught we don't bring up race, we don't talk about it, we don't address it, because that in fact is racist. And so we kind of want to break that down and say, no, we want to talk about this. We want to eradicate this idea of colorblind and I don't see color. Because again, if we don't see color, then we don't see these people and what make them up and what make them unique and special.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you said that because I will tell you, I've told you this before. I grew up in a family that was very quote unquote liberal, and I've always cared about human beings. And I did learn you don't talk about race. You don't talk about this. It's interesting because my background is Jewish, so I am a minority as well. And that was a conversation all the time because it affected us, but we didn't talk about race. And it wasn't really until like 2 years ago or so, embarrassingly, that I started realizing that that's actually not the way we want to go, that that's perpetuating racism. So I love that you said that. It's opening eyes to things that we really need to talk about. So thank you. So if we are going to have these discussions in our home, how do we even start to bring this about? And we could talk about, what's age appropriate, but how do we start these discussions in our home?
They all vary and they depend. And I think, we discussed this a little bit before, but It would really depend on the age of the child. So if we want to, talk about them and bring them up, I think the first thing that we really want to do is start with ourselves. When we're looking at race and racism and diversity and inclusion and all these, big, heavy concepts, the reality is that we have to start with where we are. We have to kind of do a self check and determine what do we know on this topic and where do we fall in this? What are my own biases? What are my stereotypes? And maybe have that conversation with a friend, a safe friend that you can talk to, or going to a podcast, or talking to, a coach or an expert on that subject, or starting with reading, online, but the reality is that you have to check where you are yourself first with this before you can take this, to your children. We joked around about that a little bit on the podcast, but the reality is that we know that children, and I have 4 of them that range from 3 to 18. And trust me, if I throw the same question out to each one of them, I'm going to get a different answer. And probably none of them are socially appropriate, maybe the 18-year-old. But the reality is that they will say anything. And so you have to be ready for whatever they're going to throw at you, because 9 times out of 10, it's going to be up in front and in your face. So starting with self, I think, is the first place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And educating ourselves so that we talked a little bit about this. And by the way, the audience who is here may not have heard our podcast episode, so we can definitely repeat things. What we talked about too was, we bring an energy, and I talk about this all the time. We bring an energy to conversations with our kids. And if, for example, we are uncomfortable with this conversation or we haven't brought it up before, we will become more comfortable if we understand our own biases. We will feel so much better. And then we will bring that energy to the conversation. And really, when we talk to our kids, I assume that we want this energy that is safe and not anxious. So starting with ourselves is a really good place.
Starting with ourselves is an amazing place. And even when you're talking to your children, saying to them, mommy didn't really understand this either. When I was a kid, we didn't get to talk about this, or this is what was going on when I was a child. And you guys are kind of experiencing things similar to I did, or the way grandma and grandpa did, or just really connecting and those connections and correlating, because then kids, it kind of normalizes it at that point. And then, they see us as, superstars or superheroes in many ways. And reality is it brings you down to a normal space. And like, really, you experienced this too, or you didn't know that too, because they think we know everything, or else they'll tell us we don't, one or the other.
Oh, that's so true. That's like a parenting quote right there. They either tell us, oh, you know everything, or you know nothing. It's so true. And I just want to read to you some of the comments that are actually being made here because it's really relevant. Someone said, I thought I was doing the right thing by avoiding it, meaning the topic. And as I continue to learn, I know now to avoid color blindness as it leads to unconscious bias. And then someone else said, same. I even remember being taught in school and church that color blindness was the right thing to do, something I want to change with my own child. So
Wow.
yeah, it's so
I love
important.
hearing that. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I
No.
love the fact that they even shared that even in church. One, I'm glad that they're talking about it in all spaces, but two, that's important, because we take where we're getting our information from allows us to kind of place a weight on it. And of course, if we're getting that from home, or we're getting that from church, or we're getting that from our teachers, these are places that have significant impact over us, over our psyche, over our development. And so we trust that information, and rightfully so. And they're probably giving us the information that they know to be right. But we know now that the more we dive into this, the more the reality is we can't be colorblind. My name is Ebony. So if for anybody that doesn't know that, it actually means black. When you go buy a car or you get paint, you will see Ebone, which is the color black. So it's so funny, because growing up through life, I really couldn't avoid my blackness by all. I kind of joke with my mom, like, you just really wanted me to identify completely with who I am. But the reality is that I have had people say to me, I don't see your color. And I would say, well, that's crazy. My name is Ebony. Like, you have to see my color. It is all about who I am, from my hair to my culture to, what I look like, unfortunately, in America and worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. Such good points. So starting with ourselves is really important. Are you going to, at some point, maybe either on here or later, give some resources that you trust for
Oh,
where people can go to
sure.
work on themselves? We can get that from you. So I don't want to put you on
Absolutely.
the spot.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so once we've worked on ourselves and we want to bring these topics up with our children, what are some ways we might want to bring this up, for example, with younger children? You gave some really good examples on the podcast. So how would you do that with a younger child?
So it's funny, I grabbed some of my things with younger children. One of I'm a book lover. So for me, my kids, all of them are not. I have one that is a bookworm, and that's about it out of 4. I think that's okay. But I go to the things that they're doing and the things that they're involving themselves in. And so one of the things that I really love is I have like a ton of books. So if I'm working with my younger kids, I do things like this. Like this is a phenomenal book. I go to the book fair and I intentionally look for the books that are speaking my language. So this one is called Throw Your Tooth on the Roof: Tooth Traditions from Around the World. So and this is by Selby Beeler. What I love about this book is everybody loses a tooth, right? So here's a commonality that we've already established. We all lose teeth. Even our dogs lose teeth. So we've got a connection right there. The second thing that I love about it is it's going around the world. So our school systems, they talk a lot about, creating global minded children, but then we really struggle to bring in the globalization in the classroom. So this book here takes your kids all the way from Greece to Germany. They jump from Europe to Eastern Europe to Russia to Thailand to Indonesia, Pakistan. So you're going through all these different traditions in one book. And in this one book, you can talk to them about what we have in common, what is different. Oh, look what their tradition is in Pakistan, how they, may do their teeth. Because of course we know even in different cultures, there still could be variations. And that's kind of complex. But the reality is we start with showing them that there are differences. We all have common things, but then we all are different in many ways. And we celebrate those differences. So I love using books with my younger children.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. And that book in particular, how you can start with what we all have in common and talk about what we all have different, and we talked about this too before, that we need to teach our children that different is normal and different is good and different, because a lot of kids assume, and especially during adolescence, we'll get to older kids, that different is bad. They want to be like everybody else. But if we can have these conversations when they're young, that different is good and that different doesn't mean we don't have other things in common. We may have some traditions. So I love that. That's excellent. Thank you. So I know I have a list too of books that you recommended for the podcast. I will also put in the group.
Yeah.
What about older children? What would you say as, they don't want to read books with you anymore? What would you start to do?
So again, older children, they don't want to read books with you, but we still can give them books. So I'm going to go to the books and then I'll go to the next thing. And I actually have some. Again, I have an 18-year-old. So this one right here, she actually went to a leadership academy. And they actually had them read this book. It's called The Hate You Give. It's a big one right now. It's a buzzing one. There's a few more out there, but this one in particular, it was phenomenal. There's a movie on Netflix, I believe. So we watched the movie together after she read the book, and it was phenomenal. It's about a Black female who grows up in an area and she ends up like falling in love or dating this white guy at her private school, but she goes back home to this where she's really from, and there's this huge dichotomy that is broken down and explained throughout this movie. So it's a great movie. It's in their language, it's on their terms, it's got parties, it's got, school and sports, and it just speaks so clearly to your high school, young college age kid. Another thing that I love you could do with kids is real life. Trevor Noah, Born a Crime. This is a great book. Actually, my children had to read this here in Loudoun County High School. So, you go through the books and we break it down. And it's the very same thing that you do with children. It's just a more complex conversation. And you really want to go deeper into the feelings. How did that make you feel when you saw, this character being treated like that? Who can you identify with that we've maybe seen recently that has been treated like that? It's just going into the more complex conversation with them. Now, if you don't have a book reader, we all have TV watchers. We all have, they're all on their iPads and phones. And so again, I think some of that is going into the things that the kids love. Recently there were ads that went out between H&M and Gucci. So you can bring those things up and say, hey guys, let's talk about this. Why do you think this was such a big deal in the media? Maybe, and have a full conversation. And the children may say something like, well, somebody put a monkey on the shirt. And then, a child who maybe is not a minority or not a Black child may not understand, well, why is a monkey, a degrading idea and concept? And this is where it goes back to one, being okay with saying, I don't know all the answers, but I'll check. And two, doing a little bit of the research first. And so when you do begin to dive into, race and stereotypes and things historically in our country, you'll learn that, monkeys were a symbol of kind of taunting at African-American children or families. And so you bring that back into the conversation with your child. Or if you don't know, you say, you know what, I don't know why that was a big deal. Let's go explore that. And you explore it together doing research, online. So again, it's just using what they have, the tangible item, and then turning that into a very, in-depth conversation.
That is so brilliant. I mean, I know you worked with adolescents, with teens, you
Yeah.
have them. I just want to reinforce that this, like, one of the biggest pieces of advice I give parents of teens is get in their world. They don't want
Mhm.
to come in your world anymore. But when you get in theirs and you ask them questions and you defer to them, it's like, what do you think? And even saying, I don't know, let's figure this out together. Or why don't you find out and teach me? Like you said, they love to tell you what to do.
They love it. They
Yeah.
love it. Teenagers, it's funny, again and again, books. I try to make my daughter, speaking of, this is called The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, who just had a birthday. She's no longer here with us, but February 18th. And so my daughter was kind of struggling with her own identity. She's a very, very fair skinned Black female. And I talked a little bit about her before, but she's of a very diverse makeup. Her grandmother is white. Her grandfather is Black. She has two Black grandparents on my side who have like a mix of race, and then she has a Guatemalan grandmother as well. And so she's got this diverse world that she's raised in. And so I think there's been moments, especially moving, that she struggled with her identity. And so we dove into this book, and I mean, I got the eye rolls and I got the all the above. And so jumping into their world, yeah, I can push the book, but what I did with her is I joined the African American History Club with her at her school, and I became a parent liaison. And I needed her to find a safe space, and I needed to help her do that. And so I jumped into her world with her. So that is just that I agree with you. That's one of the best ways to do it with them.
Yeah, and that's why I think I love you so much. And I wanted to have this conversation because you are a combination of your background in mental health and school counseling and your passion for this topic and race and gender and equality. I mean, it's just that's what makes you, I think, so amazing at this and communicating. So let's talk about the real situation that we might face where we've talked to our kids about this, but they come home and they say something that we notice is racist or is not consistent with our values. How would you talk about that with your child in that situation?
So let's see. Give me an age. Like, you want to go elementary or middle or high?
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's go. Let's go. We have a lot of parents of elementary school students in here. But if it's really different for olders, can you let us know that as well? But let's go elementary school.
So elementary school, and I think that's where you do see a lot of it rise. And I think it's important that that's where we start, because if we can, jump in and have those safe conversations early and uncomfortable conversations, we can kind of help them as they get to that older age where things can get a little rougher. And so, elementary age, an example, I probably have my own. I'm trying to think. I remember my daughter. Let's talk about Disney. So I Disney, all the girls, it's all the rage. I have 4 girls, so I'll try and think of a alternate one, but I have 4 girls, and you have all these princesses, and of course that has totally evolved at this point, but we're talking 10 years ago, my oldest, and I mean, she was obsessed with the Disney princesses. I think Cinderella was by far her favorite. And I just made sure, what I started to notice was she would do things, like want that Barbie doll, or she would be playing with her friends and there would be a conversation, where it's like, you have that one with the blonde hair, or I don't want that one with the brown hair. And so when we would come home, when we would talk about it, just us, I would have to sit and, pull the 2 Barbie dolls on. We talk about them and we would talk about the differences of the Barbie dolls. So that was kind of like one way where you see it going on. They don't really bring it to you, and you kind of, handle that conversation. Now, on the other hand, a situation, she was 6 years old at the time, and this is recent, and her best friend were playing, and her best friend is a white female. Well, she looks white, but she's actually has a European background, Mediterranean background. And so they're playing and they're like best friends and they do everything together. And so they decided to paint one day. And so they painted this beautiful picture. So the best friend paints this picture and she paints herself. And of course, it's like a peach color. And then she paints my daughter. And if you think about a typical standard, paint set with like the 6 colors, you've got like black, red, green, yellow, right? You got your standard colors. And so, of course, she paints Parker with a very dark face and like dark hair and these bright red lips. And so Parker, my friend, the mother calls me and she says, "Oh my gosh." So the girls are playing and my daughter, she painted this picture and she's like, and she just wanted to, like, she was so excited and she's so proud of it. But then Parker was like in tears, like, "That's not me. That's a black, picture." And so immediately we have to jump in and we have this conversation in a safe way on the beauty of the picture and the beauty and where the colors are and what they mean and what they represent. And so easily, where someone, a term like, well, you're black, may be stated. And because of all the negative connotation that sometimes exists within the community, we have to go back and have this dialogue. And so on both sides, it's talking with my child on understanding, that beauty is seen in one way, and then talking with the other child and understanding that this is why it was perceived that way. So it becomes a heavy conversation,
Yeah, absolutely.
you
And
know.
when you have that heavy conversation in a safe way and you're not anxious and you just hear what's going on for kids,
Right.
you're normalizing, you're reducing the anxiety, and you're making it more likely that you can talk about it again in the future.
Right.
So that's amazing. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I answered your question, because I think I know. Well, those were two scenarios. So like if we go into a third scenario where it's a little more direct, right? And we have a situation where we overhear our child make a statement that we know is not something that we taught them, or so we assume, and we're like, where did that come from? And so at that point, it is imperative, in my opinion, that we handle it on that spot. So if they're playing with their friends, or if they're on their video games, let's say it's a boy, and I've had moms, talk about that, where maybe they've overheard, their kids are on a video game and they overhear someone on the game, they can play virtually, make a statement, and then your child kind of jumps in and makes another statement. And so immediately I think we want to give, some type of discipline, and let's shut the game off. And now let's talk about what mommy heard. I overheard you saying this. And then we repeat the statement and we ask them, like, what do you think that means? I think the first part of it is checking into their comprehension of what they said or what their peer said, because a lot of times they are not aware of the impact of the statement. So when we dissect it and break it down, we can determine how much of this are they aware of. And then whatever they're not aware of, now it's our job to help them understand. So for example, I had two friends, and Indian family and a black family, and the kids are playing, they're boys. And one of the boys says to the black boy, your hair is like, what's wrong with your hair? Like, it's all like fuzzy and nasty, like you got black hair. And so immediately, the little boy automatically feels, attacked and insulted. And he goes home and he talks to mom. And these are friends. These are friends who've played together. Moms are friends. And I promise you, when your kids come home and they tell you that now you got to talk to your friend, it's a high courage conversation, but it's one that has to be had, because we want to first teach our children, right, the inappropriateness of what's been stated, and then understanding the impact of that. And then, where did you hear that from? Can you tell me where you've heard that before? And then let's talk about that. So there's, like, multiple steps to the conversations.
Absolutely. And this is going to segue into a question that someone just had, but I want to reinforce some really important things that you just said. First of all, most kids are not aware of the impact that they have when they say something. And so that's why the question that someone asked is, can you give more details on how we do talk to our children? So in the scenario you just gave, what would I say to my daughter if I was the mother of the friend who colored Parker black? So how do we talk to our children, and
Sure.
sort of, what do we say?
So the mother, if I'm the mother, and actually this was, like I said, a good friend of mine, so we talk about it. Honestly, I normalize that scenario. So the first thing is she wasn't wrong for coloring her black, right? You know who's wrong? The paint people who don't have a diversity in colors, which they have now kind of corrected. But the reality is, black is the only color that we know that represents that. So the first thing is you want to normalize that and say, there's nothing wrong with what your daughter did. That was a very unintentional scenario that can cause or create a scenario. And the second thing is, then you say, you did a great job by coloring your friend. However, the reason why she feels that way is because a lot of times in our society, black comes with a negative attachment. And so we break down attachment. A lot of times what happens is the color black is seen as ugly or dirty or not wanted or filthy, unattractive. And so then, if you have a 6 or 7 year old like ours who are pretty astute and they're on YouTube and different things, they're going to be like, what do you mean? You say, well, when you see commercials, how often do you see a black girl in those commercials? Or when we look at makeup, do you see a black girl on the makeup, ad? And so they're going to be like, I don't know, they're not really there. So now you're going into that middle school conversation, but you'll be surprised. Our kids know, you could bring it down to their level. When you see cereal commercials. And you just go into that and help them see the difference and understand why your friend may have been hurt by this color that's not really a representation of who they see themselves as.
Mhm.
And then you can turn around and do an activity like, hey, let's do a project where we paint ourselves and then we talk about it. And we say the things that we love about what we see in these images. So now you have the two girls paint or color, and then they can share, well, I love, that my hair is curly, or I love that my skin is creamy like, chocolate milk. And then the other girl can say, well, I love the fact that my hair is straight and I have, purple color on the ends. And so they can have this conversation, celebrate what they love about themselves, and then celebrate what they love about their friend. Because that's actually what my daughter's friend said. She said, I love your curly ponytails. I wish that I could get those ponytails. And so once she heard that part, she knew that coloring her hair that way was not negative. It was just the only color on the page.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, when we make them aware of, they're just so often unaware. They don't realize that what they're saying is hurtful. And I love the specific examples you gave of how we can raise their awareness. And then absolutely asking them, well, where did you hear that? So that we can start to filter where they're getting their information. Because I also believe, and I would love to defer to you on this as an expert, I also believe that we have to expose our kids to difficult things. We just have to process them with them because they are going to hear messages. So do you agree with that? Do you think that sounds
Totally agree with that. And that's actually been a really big question that's been coming up a lot, like especially with what we've been seeing right now. We have protests going on now. This does vary too with older kids because they are aware more so of what they're saying. They may not understand the ramifications and the full impact, but they're often way more aware of
yeah,
what words are coming out of their mouth. So but when it comes to children and really having those tough conversations, those brave conversations, I like to call them, you really don't want to shy away from them. Again, as a minority, I'm going to have to sit and I'm going to have the conversation why there was, a police shooting and what that means and what that looks like. My husband is a Black male and his mother was a sergeant. She retired in New Jersey, and she raised her son from a very early age on what to do when you're pulled over by the police officer. So as a teenager, he understood, when I'm driving, what do I need to do? So these are conversations that minorities oftentimes cannot steer away from because it becomes life or death, or it can become life or death, unfortunately. So with our children who maybe aren't going to be at risk for that, we still want to have that conversation, and you connect it with their friends. You connect it to what we see in the media. And these are hard conversations. You can use podcasts. There's tons out there, and we'll share some of them, later, where they go into what that conversation looks like or how to talk about even a more specific scenario that just happened so that you can kind of get an idea and then go back and do that, with your child. But you can't not have the conversation because they see it, their friends are talking about it, and they're reading about it.
absolutely. And I love what you just did. I'm going to do this from now on, very honestly, because I talk to parents obviously all the time. You switched from it's a tough conversation to it's a brave conversation. And I think that distinction is huge because we fear a tough conversation. It's like, oh, I don't want to do this, but a brave conversation, we want our kids to be brave. We want to be brave. I love that. Can I steal that from you? I'll give you credit.
You can steal it.
No, I'm going to give you credit, but I want to use that as well with credit to you.
Absolutely. Please do, because that's what it is. It's having those brave conversations.
Yeah, and it's important. It really, really is. So I want to get to parents' questions. So I will say, those of you who are here who want to post questions, go ahead and start doing that. I also want to give you, though, Ebony, a chance. Is there anything that you didn't cover that you want to, as we're waiting for people to post if they have questions?
Honestly, I think we kind of hit on it, and I really want to, answer the questions, but I think ultimately there is that three, making sure we have the clarity in where to start, and always starting with self, and starting with uncovering as much information as you can and soaking in, and just really challenging your own belief system. And then the second part that we didn't discuss was, a lot of times when we may notice that our children, make statements or associate things a certain way, you can think, I didn't raise them like that. But then if you take a step back and you do, one of the exercises that we did in our group is looking at your social circle and your bubble, because children know, they see early on what that bubble looks like and kind of the norms that we establish. If we're always only seeking experts out that look like us. If all our doctors are, exactly what we look like, if all of our teachers are exactly what we look like, if only people we invite over for dinner are what we look like, our pastor is what we look like, what is the subconscious or the indirect message that we're sending to our children? And that's not intentional, right? Because we operate within our comfort zones.
So
But the
true.
goal is to push ourselves outside of that.
So true, which is why I absolutely love that you said having these brave conversations, because everything we want in life is, this is a quote, everything we want in life is right beyond our comfort zone. So
Absolutely.
teaching our kids that differences are good and that we want to bring more into our lives, and having these conversations, it really is about being brave. And that's where you're going to see raising children who really can potentially make a difference in the world. So I love that. I just want to reinforce, if anyone does want to, there haven't been any questions yet. If anyone does want to ask a question, Ebony is here. You have her expertise, her brilliant mind with you now. If not, we may be able to reach her later. In fact, if there aren't any, I will ask you now, just in case no questions come up. How can someone reach you later? Because they may have questions as they're watching the replay or something comes up later. How can people reach you?
Please reach me by my email. It is ebeb@bravethroughcoaching.com.
Excellent. And I'm going to put that obviously with the recording as well. So, and I can, well, I would type it here, but people won't see those notes. So go ahead.
I have a question for you, Rachel.
Yeah, sure.
Over the years, over the year, like I know this has been like a big, thing recently. Have you had anybody kind of, present you with a scenario that, maybe you can remember that we can talk about? I know it's been a long year, but probably more
Yeah.
towards the summer, there might have been things that come up, just how to talk to the kids or.
To be honest, there was one that came up in the group that I know you answered. It was
Right.
someone calling someone, but I forget what exactly it was.
She's not pretty because she's Black.
Yeah,
I think
she's not pretty because she's Black. Yeah. So that one came up, but very honestly, people don't come to me with this question very often. And I don't know if it's because I don't talk about this topic enough, which honestly is a mistake. And I have another friend who's in this group who's actually here right now. So I hope it's okay that I call you out. And she had said to me, we talk about this. I need to be doing more talking about this, which is why I'm so glad that you and I are bringing this out. But I think I don't do enough, so people don't know they can come to me. So I haven't had those questions. And that's something I'm working on, is how do I bring up these conversations? Because just because someone isn't asking me doesn't mean I shouldn't bring it up.
Right.
As my teacher, Ebony, is that true? Probably.
Absolutely. That is true. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because if you're thinking it, they're thinking it, right?
That's very, very true. That's very true. And I do see a question coming up from someone else. So
Okay.
I come from Europe, where I wasn't exposed to racial differences and proper social way to address them. How do I teach myself and my children about the complexity of race without labeling?
I love it. So one of my really good friends, and neighbor, she is actually from Europe as well. And I mentioned that, and her daughter and my daughter are like literally best friends. And, we discuss this a lot. She has a very diverse background. And so, not growing up in America, a lot of times she does not understand the historical components of race and racism in America. And so the reality is, and let's be honest, which we've learned in our group, many people in America don't have a true concept of, race and history in America. And so the first part, honestly, is starting with some of those resources. And I'm going to share them with, Rachel. And the reason why the education piece is component, and I'm big on this, a lot of times we want to get out and we want to take action. Protesting is amazing, joining in a solidarity and support for people and being there in a collaborative, safe, peaceful effort. But at the same time, educating yourself is by far always going to be the greatest, starting point. And knowledge is power. And once you have knowledge and understanding, which is why we're here today, right? To seek out the knowledge. When you have that, it allows you to think in a more complex way and attack a situation, from more, not necessarily in the box, but from an out of box perspective, because you have, you have more insight and you are able to look at that at a greater way. And so when you are able to go back and look at the history and the components, it allows you to be a little more sensitive. It allows you to be a little more understanding, which leads us to a key component in all this, which is empathy. It allows you to develop empathy, where I may not have walked that walk with you. I may not understand that, but I have empathy for what I have witnessed and what I cannot deny that my eyes have seen. And so that's the piece. When you develop that empathy, it allows you to want to do more and to want to change the narrative and to want to educate even your children at a greater capacity.
That's I love that, absolutely. And that's also something that's in our control, is to educate ourselves. We can control what our kids think, but we can educate ourselves. And I would add too, I wonder if learning with your kids at the same time, if you don't have an awareness of American history because you grew up in Europe and they might not have taught that.
Yeah.
And like you said, we don't even have a full understanding of American history. We learned the warped version, the white version. Doing it all together, saying, I haven't learned this history. Let's do it together. And I think that can be a great way to connect with kids.
It can, and again, and that's something that I really love, and I'm going to start taking on more of that, is really working with people in that aspect. But there are some great stuff out there. I mean, NPR by far, I'm just really impressed with some of the stuff they push out. There's a ton of good things, and I'll, give you a list of those resources that parents can go to and use, and safe enough to sit with your child with, some that you can do with your spouse, and some things that you may want to do on your own to uncover your own, self identity and concept of all of this. But I love that question, and I love the willingness, to identify the fact that, I'm not aware of this, and where can I go for that information and how to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions at this point, and I know I want to respect everybody's time. It's the middle of the day. Ebony, thank you so much for being here. I always learn so much every single time I talk to you, and I love it. Thank you. I appreciate your time. I also appreciate the time of everyone else who listened to this conversation, because it's an important one. And I am definitely going to be doing more of this, both in this group and out of this group. Ebony and I are going to be talking about how we can get the message out there. So thank you all for being here, for really being motivated to educate yourself and your children, because this is so incredibly important. So everyone have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you all soon.
Bye. Thanks, Rachel.
Bye. Thank you.